Hey, everybody. So let's see, notifications off. OK, we're all good. So my name's Ezer. It's a real honor to be here. This is my 5th time at EmberConf, my first time speaking. So I'm really excited. That was a great introduction. So my title of my talk is Composable Concurrency Tasks, and I'm talking about Ember Concurrency. So when we talk about Ember Concurrency, this is a tool for dealing with asynchrony, right? Asynchrony is the meaning in this case is problems that often arise in our front-end apps when things can happen in arbitrary orders. So in honor of asynchrony, I'm using an interesting feature of Keynote that you might not be aware of. It's called Pulp Fiction mode. So basically, my slides are configured to come up in random orders. So let's see what happens. So what are we going to get next? Congratulations, you've now learned how to build Ember Concurrency decorators. And what do we have next? Thank you for listening. That's it for today. Thank you. Just kidding, just kidding. So yeah, I've been lucky to live in a lot of places. Being a developer allows you to frequently travel and see the world. So I grew up in Toronto, Canada, lived in Tokyo, Japan for a few years, lived in New York, and I'm currently living in Berlin. A little disappointed that I couldn't find a Toronto Tomster. What's up with that? I have to talk to Mattia about that later. So I've been using Ember since 2013 when it was in pre-beta, and the first app I worked on was called To Be. Some of you might remember this. It's a digital art platform. Yeah, heard a few cheers? It's a digital art platform. You can kind of make collages called fields where you take different GIFs and videos, put them together, and then you could kind of paint on an HTML5 canvas and make digital works of art. So I didn't really, yeah, people have demoed it before. When I first came to EmberConf in 2014, I met Jamie White from London, and we became really good friends. And when he saw To Be, he made this amazing collage of everyone who went to the first EmberConf. Isn't it fun how young everybody looks up there? Nathan Hammond has his long hair. Steph Penner doesn't have a beard. Tom Dale still has his Portland shirt. Yeah, so this is still live on the web. The founders of To Be moved on to other things. It's not really under active development, but I took this screenshot a couple days ago, and it's on Ember 1.3. So that gives you an idea of how old it is and when I left the project. And I did a lot of those upgrades, too. We started in an alpha version, then we went through the beta and the 1.0. So, but it's still there. You could go to this website, 2.b/jgwhite, and check it out. After, about 2015, I stopped working at To Be and I started consulting. So I worked for a company you might have heard of called 201 Created. And I've worked with a lot of great companies who use Ember. And there's a lot of friends I made in this room, people I met at some of the clients I worked at. So for example, I did some work at Twitch, met a lot of people there through 201. I worked at Fastly. There's a lot of people from Fastly here I've worked with. I did an interesting project for the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in Manhattan, which is a really cool museum. So yeah, it's been a great being a part of the Ember community, and I'm really happy to be here today. So I'm talking about Ember Concurrency. I saw the show of hands. Most people have used it. Put your hand up if you've not used it. Might be easier to judge. Cool, there's still a decent number of people who are seeing it for the first time. So Ember Concurrency from their docs is an Ember add-on that makes it easy to write concise, robust, and beautiful asynchronous code, and it uses generators. This was covered a bit yesterday, too, because Preston Sego gave a really good talk called Comparing Patterns in React and Ember. Turns out he's into swing dancing, too, and so am I. So there's some weird, if you want to do like a Freudian analysis of why people who give talks about Ember Concurrency also like swing dancing, I don't know. Something about the words asynchronous and synchronization, or syncopation, I'm not exactly sure. Tough crowd, tough crowd. So the agenda today, I'm going to talk about generators, which is a relatively new feature in JavaScript that's basically at the core of Ember Concurrency. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ember Concurrency itself. And then the topic of this talk is higher order Ember Concurrency tasks, which I'm going to talk about. So how you could build your own, or how I built my own, and also there's some community add-ons that are out there. So what are generators? So this is straight from the MDN docs. A generator is basically a function that can yield intermediate values and pause execution and then restart execution. So this is a simple example. This generator takes a value I, and it'll yield that value, and then if you call next on it again, it'll yield that value plus 10. So the way you use this is on line 6, you instantiate the generator with some value, in this case 10, and every time you call next on that generator instance, it'll return a new value. What next actually returns is an object with two properties, the value and also a done Boolean, which could be true or false. It'll be false until it's done, and when there are no more yields, it'll be true. So here's another example that also shows the done flag. Why might you want to use this? One good example is for making an incrementing ID maker. So this ID maker has an internal variable set to 0, and every time you call next on it, it will yield that current value and then increment the value. So you would keep getting incrementing values. Excuse me. There's another new feature of JavaScript that goes really well with this. Is a new type of for loop called the for of loop. So this allows you to take generators and make iterators from them. So here's an example of another simple generator foo, which yields two values, 1 and 2. And with this for loop, for let of foo, the new syntax is of. It'll log each value, 1 and 2. And one neat thing about this is just like any other for loop, you could break in the middle. So in this example, we console log the first value, and then we break. That second value never gets returned, and it never even gets computed. So line 3 there will never get run. And that's basically the key concept behind the magic of Ember Concurrency. Because if that line 3 was some expensive API call that you've decided you no longer want to do because the component was destroyed, it's never going to execute that. We're going to look into that in more detail in a second. So I was doing some stuff with graphs recently, and I realized that generators and iterators are a really good way to deal with graphs. So one way you could represent a graph is a 2x2 or an n-by-n adjacency matrix, where each cell has some non-zero edge cost if there's an edge from those two nodes, right? So for example, there's an edge here from 0 to 1 of cost 5. So in column 0, row 1, there's a number 5. There's an edge from 1 to 2, so that value is 9 there. And actually, you don't even really need a two-dimensional matrix here. You could do a flat kind of n-by-n array and just do a little bit of arithmetic to actually represent this graph. So here, this would be the setEdge function, does source times size plus dest, and sets the cost in that flat array. And then getEdge would just return that value, and it'll default to 0. We'll come back to this code altogether in a second. But here's the neat part, is the iteration. So this is a new syntax we haven't seen yet today, star and then a method name. That's how you define a generator method in a JavaScript class. So this generator method will be a part of the graph class that you've instantiated. And what this does is iterate over all the possible vertices in your graph, but it only yields actual edges that are in the graph. So that is pairs of vertices that have an actual edge with a non-zero cost. So this is a nice way of abstracting away your underlying implementation of the graph, right? Users of this graph don't actually have to know that it's an array and a matrix, and they don't have to deal with possibly getting any zero values. So to put it all together, this is how you might use that. So you instantiate the graph, set 3 edges, loop over the edges. So graph.getEdges0 gives you all the edges that start at node 0, and there are 2 of them. And console, if we log those out, we just log the 2 edges. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you might want to use generators just at a basic level in your code without necessarily having to do it with Ember Concurrency. And here's the code altogether if you want to have a look. So you might be wondering, can I use these in my code today? So I went on caniuse.com. Turns out they are supported by most major browsers. Not IE11, but there are polyfills out there. I saw something kind of interesting in the long tail of kind of more rare browsers here. So I'm Canadian, so I noticed BlackBerry browser. Blackberries are invented in Canada, and the only people I know who still use them are Canadian. So I'm a little bit sad that my Canadian friends with their Blackberries can't use native generators, but thank goodness for polyfills. I found out at the speaker dinner that Jessica Jordan also has a BlackBerry, so that's one counterexample. So coming back to Ember Concurrency, we talked about it. Most people here have seen it or heard of it. Let's start talking about what it actually does, and then we'll talk a little bit about how it works. You may have seen the docs. The docs are excellent. I'm not going to repeat everything in the docs, but they build up an example of how you might get some complexity in your apps when you're trying to make a real-world production app doing asynchronous stuff. So this is an example app they have with an asynchronous API probably built into the browser to get your geo-coordinates, and then another asynchronous API called getNearbyStores, which you would send those coordinates, and it would return some stores that are near where you're living. So you can see there's a lot of complexity here, right? If you want to show a loading spinner, you need to manually track some Boolean. Is there a request in flight? That's that is finding stores return at the top. You're going to need to set it to false no matter what happens in the finally, and you need to check is destroyed because you can't call set on a destroyed object, right? I see heads nodding. We all know that. What else? Yeah, those are the main bits of complexity here that Ember Concurrency is really good at abstracting away. And then the template, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. You have an action on the first line. There's that if block for the loading spinner, and then iterating over the results within each. So let's look at how Ember Concurrency simplifies that. Here you have an Ember Concurrency task. You don't need any isDestroyed checks. You can just yield each intermediate promise and then set the result at the end, and the UI, the user experience is exactly the same. A couple changes in the template here are there's a perform helper from Ember Concurrency, which you use to perform a task. And the key point is for that loading spinner, we don't need a separate variable because Ember Concurrency tasks, the find stores task property here, knows if it's running or not. That's part of the metadata of an Ember Concurrency task. And there's actually one way we can simplify this even further, because we can completely get rid of the result property. So you see result : null on the first line, and this dot set result on the second line. On the last line, we can completely get rid of that. So here's another example. So here, we could just return the last result, and Ember Concurrency tasks also know when they've started. They know when they've run successfully what all the values were that were returned. So you could do find store.lastSuccessful.value.stores, and you can just iterate over that. In a real-world app, you might want to make an alias for this, but it's nice to know that it works, and you don't need to track it yourself. So let's look a little bit about chained promises and how Ember Concurrency makes them cancelable when they wouldn't normally be. So this is a simple example of a component. Ignore the stuff on the left. It's just like simulating an API call by waiting a second before returning a number. But the stuff on the right, if you were to write a bunch of chained promises here, for example, even though it's a task, it still has 5.thens, and each time it'll yield that intermediate value. And then we also do some logging on console.destroyed. So what I've built to demo this is a simple app with a toggle button. When I press the button, it'll render this component. It'll start hitting those API calls once a second. And when I toggle again, we can destroy, and we can see what continues to happen when we've destroyed. So let's watch that. Nope. Let's see. There we go. So I call this thing the slow loader. Just logging each time. Once we destroy it, it's gone. Now let's see what happens when we destroy after the second return. So it keeps looping. Obviously not ideal, right? We know isDestroyed is true. Ideally, we wouldn't do any further API calls. Now you might be thinking async await is a good solution to this, but it turns out it's not, because async await is just equivalent to using a bunch of .thens. But if instead of async await, you yield at every single step inside of the concurrency task, then Ember Concurrency is actually able to cancel those subsequent requests. So let's see what that looks like. So we're still going to run it through the first time, logging all 5 numbers. Then it's destroyed. This time we'll destroy after 2. That third one was still in flight, so we still log once. But we didn't have to do the 4th and 5th requests. So that's pretty cool. That's basically how Ember Concurrency works. Each time before it yields, it can check if the component was destroyed, or there might be a bunch of other reasons why you wanted to cancel the thing you were working on. So here are the diffs of the 3 things that I showed: chain.thens, async await, and then a bunch of yields is the thing you really want. So now I'm going to move on to some recent Ember Concurrency use cases that I've had in an app. So I was using this library called nprogress.js for doing loading spinners, or you know that big loading bar that goes across the page, the blue one. And then I'm using Ember CLI Flash as well by Lauren Tan for doing Flash messages. So if there's any API error in my app, I want to show an error message in like a central place in my style. So here's how it looks together. Here's a quick demo. You can tell I'm not a designer. I zoomed right in, and so that loading spinner kicks off, and if there's an error because I haven't entered anything, we get the error, cannot be blank. This type of thing is pretty easy to implement in a concurrency task. So let's look at the code. Oh, sorry, I saw Kenneth's talk earlier, so I shouldn't be using words like easy, simple, just. This is like complex stuff. It's OK if you don't grok it all right away. You know, we're all learning. But this is what the task looked like when I implemented it. So this is the real-world code from the app. I had separate services for managing each of the things, those 2 elements, the progress bar and the flash messages. So the first thing I do in the task is call progress.start. In the finally, I make sure I will call progress.done no matter what happened. Kick off my API call. In this case, I'm using Ember CLI change set as well, so I'm doing a change set.save. If that's successful, call the onComplete action. And if there's an error, grab the error message and send it to flash messages. So I wrote this, and I was pretty happy. It felt like a good use of Ember Concurrency. In fact, it was so good that I kept copying and pasting it, and copying and pasting it, and copying and pasting it. So I wondered, is there a way I can abstract this? Can I make some sort of, I thought I would call it maybe like a progress task helper that abstracts these 2 things away from the So the only thing that would change would be the API call. So I Googled it. Wrapping Ember concurrency tests. First thing I thought about Googling. And amazingly, I found something. So there was this PR that was merged to Ember concurrency way back in January 2017, PR number 117, by Ben Domboski. I wonder if he's here. If he, come say hello if you're here. And yeah, this got merged. The code change to the actual add-on codes, it's just a couple lines. Almost said it was simple. It's just a couple lines, but they have a lot of meaning. So just to get the kind of nomenclature right, I really liked Lisa Backer's talk yesterday when she talked about when learning a new plugin, you want to first get the terminology right before you kind of go any further. So I think the terminology is helpful for Ember concurrency. So what you define on your component is called a task property. And that property has some metadata, like is it running or not, does it have data? You can also perform an instance of it. And inside that task property, it has another thing called a task function, which is the code you would actually use to execute the task. So this code change allows users to look at a task property and actually grab the task function off of it and change it. And this turns out to be really powerful. So here's an example. The tests for this PR were really great, told me everything I needed to actually implement this thing. So in this case, this unit test for the feature, we basically just want to have a counter to know how many Ember concurrency tasks are in flight at a given time. So you can see here on line 7, we grab the original task function off the task property stored in a variable, and overwrite on line 9 a new task function, which is another generator, takes the same arguments, increments a task run counter, yields the original task function, and then decrements. So one of the most powerful things about generators is generators can yield other generators and apply them. So I used this technique to write what I called the progress task helper in my app. I made a new subfolder under app called tasks, called this thing progress, and this is the code for it. I used the getOwner API from Ember to grab the services I needed, so I wouldn't have to inject each of those services into all the components I'm going to use. And it's all internal to this task function. So we can grab the progress service from the container, call start on it, yield the original task function, and if there's an error, send that error to the flash messages. So I'll keep this code on the screen, but I'll also show on the right what happened to my component when I did that. So it's quite a nice refactor, ended up with just 2 lines. And intuitively, it's those right 2 lines. Those are the only things that are probably going to change from one component usage to another, right? Maybe there's going to be some additional step, like rolling back attributes if it failed, or just doing some sort of alternative API call. But I'm really happy that everything about progress tasks and error handling is just abstracted away in this progress task helper. So now let's look at some other use cases, because there's a couple interesting add-ons already in the community that also use this technique. So one is by Ben Domboski, and I'm assuming that when he opened that PR, he wanted to do this type of thing, and he made an add-on called Ember Concurrency Test Waiter. So one issue with Ember Concurrency when it first came out is that it's a little bit hard to make your tests aware when there are Ember Concurrency tasks running in flight. So this is an example he has in his docs of a task that asynchronously fetches an image, grabs the dimensions off the image, and displays those dimensions in the template. So it sets them on the component so that I could show them in the template. So here's the test. This looks like a pretty reasonable integration test. Set up rendering test, render the image component, assert that the DOM has some loading ... text. Await settled, that's a helper built into Ember for making sure that promises are in flight, or promises are finished, or maybe concurrency tasks are finished. You would hope that this would just work, and then you would be able to assert that has text, those dimensions are on the page. Turns out this doesn't reliably work. It sometimes works. And those are the worst types of tests, right? Maybe it works on your machine, but not your coworker's machine. Maybe it works on your machine, but it doesn't work on CI, right? It's a disaster. And the reason it doesn't work is you have to tell Ember's test runner to know that these tasks are in flight. And there's a way to do that. So basically, without getting into the details yet, this add-on exports a helper called with_test_waiter. It's a wrapper for your Ember concurrency tasks, and it allows Ember concurrency to notify Ember's test runner that there's something in flight. And this would actually work. So this change is enough to make it pass. So await settled will know what to do. And here's the implementation. So this is how it works. So has anyone registered a test waiter before? Show of hands. Cool, just a few people. So a test waiter is basically a function that Ember will repeatedly call when a test is running. If the waiter returns true, it means there's nothing kind of in flight, and the test can continue. If it returns false, it means that something's happening that Ember has to wait for. So in this case, we have a counter, task run counter that starts at 0. If there are any tasks in flight, that's going to increment. It's going to be greater than 0. And this register waiter here will cause Ember to wait for that test to complete, for the task to complete before advancing the test. So that works nicely. If you didn't like importing that wrapper to use this thing and everywhere in your code where you might use it, there's also a property modifier here called with test waiter, which is a little bit more ergonomic. You don't have to import anything. And the way you would implement that is just somewhere in your code in an initializer or something, you would need to add with test waiter onto the task property prototype. So I think I have a little bit of time left, maybe 5 minutes. There's another really cool add-on in the community by a different person named Max Firka. And this is called Ember Concurrency Retriable. So if you're dealing with a real-world API that's very inconsistent and fails fairly often, you might want to have some sort of retry policy to wait some number of milliseconds before retrying. This add-on uses the same principles we've been talking about to implement that in a pretty nice way, declarative way. So one way to do that, you can import the delay policy class from the add-on, give it instantiate it with an array of delays. These are in milliseconds of how long to wait before doing the request. And if that promise fails, if the API call fails, Ember Concurrency will keep retrying on that schedule. Once it's run out of delays in the array, then it will finally stop and actually throw an error. So let's see how this works. There's a couple other things in this code here. So get promise is just like a thing that immediately rejects. Ember Concurrency has additional events you could hook into. So this add-on creates a retrying event, which is kind of cool. So the way we're actually going to log this is by creating a new event on the task called retrying and logging out each time it retries. So we can see the demo if that works. Using that slow loader component again, but it's constantly failing. You can see it's going to wait and wait. Get some water while it waits for 4 seconds. So that works pretty well. I think that's a nice use case of the add-on. And let's see. So there's even in this add-on an exponential back-off policy, which is also really cool. So you can say there's a min delay of 500, multiplier of 2, max delay at 8,000. This will keep going up from half a second to 1 second, 2 seconds, et cetera. And to demo this, what I'm going to show is this is kind of a cool API in the browser, console.time and console.timeend. Do people know what this does? Probably some do, some don't. So if you call console.time with a string, the browser will log nothing. If you then call console.timeend with the same string, the browser will log that string and how many milliseconds elapsed since you called console.time. So it's a pretty quick and dirty and fast way to do some performance measuring. So let's do the demo here. So it keeps rejecting, and it's basically going through the exponential back-off policy. So this could be a really useful add-on in your apps, and I think they did a great job here. Is that me? Oh, no, is that someone's phone? Say hi for me. Cool, so I gave a practice run of this talk in Berlin, in Ember Berlin, early March. It was great to force myself to get all the slides done. Gave the whole talk, went pretty well, and then someone put up their hand and said, I'm actually Max Firka. Great, and I was like, wow, that's amazing, what the heck? So it was really nice to meet him in person. Here we took a selfie. This is at Klöckner's office, having some beer after the meetup. I think that's one of the great parts about the Ember community, that people travel, and even if they're on holiday, they pop in if there's an Ember meetup in their city, and they can meet people, and we all kind of develop relationships that way. And these names go from a GitHub handle to someone you've actually met in real life. So it was really cool I got to meet him. So what did we learn today? Well, most people here have used Ember Concurrency before, so you didn't need convincing. But if you've never used it before, hopefully you've learned that Ember Concurrency can make your code very expressive and succinct. So we took this huge example on the left with a bunch of kind of error-prone stuff that you might not get right every time, and we changed it to something on the right, which was a lot more concise. And Ember Concurrency is taking care of a lot of stuff for you. And then hopefully what the next kind of level that I might have shown here, hopefully I've shown, is that with this concept of wrappers or Ember Concurrency decorators, you can make your app scalable and production ready in a few specific ways. So you can create abstractions for the things that you're repeatedly doing the same way in Ember Concurrency. And you could also build some helpers for things like testing, error handling, retry schedules. So there's that power. So I'd love to see, maybe in the next year or so, what other Ember Concurrency decorators people come up with here in the community. So I'd like to thank Alex Machnier, first of all, for doing an amazing job creating this add-on. Everyone seems to love Ember Concurrency. It's really useful. I'd also like to thank Ben Dembowski, Max Firka, and Lauren Tan for the other add-ons that I showed today. And I'd like to thank you all for listening. Thank you very much.